Welcome to today's program, the 2024 presidential election, the American Constitution, and what happens next with AJ Jacobs. First off, I'm Jessica Malkin, Chief Growth Officer at Cresset, and as many of you know, Cresset is an award-winning independent multifamily office and private investment firm with over $60 billion in assets under management. We were founded with a vision to reinvent the way people experience wealth by providing access to talent, ideas, and investment opportunities available to the largest single-family offices and endowments. And our extensive ecosystem of industry leaders provides opportunities to connect directly with a variety of notable people, including thought leaders like AJ Jacobs. Our guest today is here to reassure us that this isn't the first time that our democracy seemed to hang in the balance. New York Times bestselling author and journalist AJ Jacobs spent a year following the strictest interpretation of the Constitution, and through his research found that the men who came together to put quill to parchment had wildly different visions for our country, from how many presidents we should have to whether states or the federal government should hold more power. Despite their disagreements, however, the founding fathers eventually reached a consensus and created a set of principles that still guide us today. Today, AJ will share what he learned about the famous but little-read 230-year-old document that holds an outsized influence on our daily lives. He will also talk about why the president and Supreme Court hold more power today than ever before in history, and why that should concern all of us. Finally, he'll share why he has decided to adopt some of the customs and practices, perhaps wearing the hat he's wearing today, from his year of living constitutionally into his modern life. So sit back and get ready to hear some surprising and enlightening truths about our past and how it informs our future. And so with that, I will turn things over to Cresset co-founder and chairman, Eric Becker, and AJ. Welcome.
Thank you,
Jessica. AJ, as Jessica mentioned, this wonderful book that you've written that I really enjoyed reading, and hopefully all of our guests have a copy of on their way to them, The Year of Living Constitutionally. You spent a year following the strictest interpretation of the Constitution, including writing with a quill pen, walking around Manhattan with a musket, having a soldier quarter with the family, and all of this. And the biggest first question has to be, why did you decide to do all of this?
an excellent question. Well, first of all, thank you to Jessica, and thank you to Eric, and thank you to everyone for coming, and Cresset for having me. I'm delighted to be here and talk about these issues. This came about because I read a statistic a few years ago that 60% of adult Americans have never read the Constitution. And I realized I'm in that 60%. And by the way, I think that's a little bit of an understatement. I think I was in the 80%. And yet every day I would read the news and see what a massive influence this 238-year-old document had on every part of our lives, on our healthcare, on our jobs, on what we can say. And I thought, I want to try to understand the Constitution. And as a journalist, I like to understand things by living them, sort of the, method acting. I'm sort of a method writer. So I did one about the Bible, where I lived biblically with sandals and a beard and all that. And I thought, let me try the same thing with this. And so I got a board of constitutional advisors, great professors from all over. And then I bought myself this tricorn hat. I got a musket off of ye old internet. And I just spent the time trying to understand the Constitution. What did our founding fathers mean when they wrote this? And I wanted to live using the technology and mindset. And it was a little bizarre and at times absurd, maybe a lot of times absurd, but it was also fascinating and enlightening. And I feel I learned so much and gained so much insight, and hopefully a little bit of optimism as well, a little cautious optimism.
Which is awesome. And I love the idea. And hopefully as we go through all of this, it doesn't always end that way, but it would be amazing if we leave with a sense of optimism from the totality of this experience. Talk a little bit more about living constitutionally. We've got some cool pictures that are flashing up. And what was it like to live constitutionally?
Right. So I was trying to express my rights as they were written back in 1789. So that meant, for my First Amendment right, was I wrote much of the book with a quill pen and ink because that's what the first, it didn't mean tweeting or Zooming. I tried to, I had a musket because that was the main gun back then. By the way, those are election cakes, which maybe we can talk about earlier. That was a now forgotten 18th century ritual tradition of making cakes on election day, which I tried to restart. And that was one of the reasons for optimism, one of the many. And so it was fascinating. And my wife didn't always love it. She didn't love the ink all over her apartment. She didn't love the smell of the beef tallow candles. But I found it incredibly enlightening, especially talking to these scholars about what did the Constitution mean then? What does it mean now? How much should it evolve? All of these very difficult and fascinating questions. And by the way, that's me in the halls of Congress, meeting with a senator. That's the election cake. That's me with my musket on the Upper West Side of New York, where I live. I joined a reenactors group, and that's me at the Battle of Monmouth in New Jersey. So all of these things are made for a fascinating year.
And so for the benefit of really all of us, if you could maybe start with a quick primer on the Constitution, the basics that we hopefully learned in elementary school, but as I'm getting older, it's a bit in the past. So how was the Constitution created?
It was in 1787. There was a constitutional convention where 55 men gathered and debated in this hot summer with the windows closed, no air conditioning, no fans. And they came to this document, which I think most people agree has three parts. One is the preamble, which is sort of like a mission statement. And that is my favorite part, actually. It talks about the blessings of liberty and the quest for the common good, the general welfare. It talks about we the people, and that is so important that it's about we the people, not we the states. It's we the people. And then there's the articles, which are basically the rules on how to make rules, how government should be put together. And they had the brilliant idea to do this balance of power so that there's not one person who has too much control over our lives. And then the third part is the amendments, because they knew it was a flawed document. It was a flawed document. They even have I wouldn't call them typos, but there are quillos in the Constitution. The word Pennsylvania is spelled two different ways, P-E-N-N and P-E-N Sylvania. But they were smart enough to know that it could be improved and made more perfect. So that's the amendments. And the first 10, we interpret them now as having a lot to do with individual rights. They saw them somewhat as individual rights, but also a lot about state rights and having the federal government not impinge on state rights. So that's the big picture of the Constitution.
And these first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights, certainly the most famous and commonly cited. But what was it that changed in the 1930s? It wasn't always the case, and something changed. What was that?
Well, this was fascinating, and I did not know this, but those 10, the Bill of Rights, as we call them now, which they weren't called back then, they did not apply to individuals. At the time they were written, it was all about the federal government not being allowed to impinge on states and individual rights, but mostly states. So the First Amendment says we have freedom of speech, freedom of press. That was meant to say the federal government can't make laws, but states could and did. It was much more constrained. So New York State, where I live, and when the Constitution when our country started, they had laws against blasphemy and cursing. You couldn't say the word damn, or you would be fined 37.5 cents. That's how much one damn, 75 cents, just right there. And I tried to institute that because I have teenage sons. I thought it would be good. So that shows how much things have evolved, how they've changed, because now the Bill of Rights applies to individuals. And this came about after the 14th Amendment, which was after the Civil War and the several Supreme Courts. So our conception of the Constitution is quite different from the conception of the founders. And in some cases, I think this is wonderful. It was a racist time, it was a sexist time, so I'm glad that we've evolved towards a fairer world. In other ways, I think it's a mistake. They, for instance, saw Congress as leading the train. They didn't have trains back then. That was that was the #1 part of government. And the president and the Supreme Court were much less powerful. That has flip-flopped. Now the president and the Supreme Court are the ones in charge, and the Congress is much less powerful.
Interesting. And then this whole idea of how amendments come into being, the last new amendment, the 27th Amendment, came in 1992. Why is it might need to evolve?
Yes, the amendments are so important because, as I said, they knew that this was an imperfect document. The founders, I believe, did not anticipate it would be this difficult to pass amendments. They wanted it to be hard. You don't want to change it every other day, but they wanted to be able to change the Constitution. They did not see this really rigid two-party system coming, even though it did start very early. James Madison thought it would be more like 6 or 7 parties, more like a European Parliament type system. But we are stuck with these 2 parties, and you need 2/3 of Congress to make an amendment, and you can't get 2/3 of Congress to agree on the color of green peppers. So it is very hard, and as you say, we have not had one since 1992. Now, when that happens, as society changes and evolves, something needs to change. So either you're going to have amendments, and many other countries have lots of amendments. We have the hardest amendment process on earth, but that is partly why this idea of a living constitution became popular, is because people said, well, we can't change the actual text, so let's change the interpretation of the text. So when the 14th Amendment talks about equal protection under the laws, when they wrote that, they were not thinking of women or gay people and gay marriage, but the living constitutionalist side says that's what we have to evolve. We can't change the words, let's change the meaning.
And didn't you you proposed a new amendment, the 28th Amendment, and so how did that go? How did it go trying to attempt one yourself?
Well, yes, in the First Amendment, one of my rights is to petition the government for a redress of grievances. And petitions actually are a huge, nowadays, they're just on the internet, no one really pays attention. But back in the day, they were very powerful. They were part of the reason why abolition happened. And I thought, let me try an old school petition. So I got one with actual paper and people signed with a quill pen. Now I talked earlier about sort of the ridiculous and the sublime. The petition was a bit tongue-in-cheek, but with a serious point. The petition said that we should consider getting rid of a single president and instead go back to the idea of 3 presidents or even more. And let me, just to quick context, when at the convention, one of the delegates said, I guess we should have a single president, many of the other delegates said, are you jesting? That's a terrible idea. We just fought a war to get rid of a monarch. You're trying to elect another monarch? This is the fetus of monarchy, they said. It'll just grow in power. They said we need a council of presidents, 3 presidents, 12 presidents. And it was a long, hard-fought battle. 7 states voted for 1 president, 3 voted for multiple presidents. If 2 states had done differently, can you imagine how differently the history of the world would look? And the prediction that one of the delegates said, that it's the fetus of monarchy, I think is true. The fetus is now a teenager. The amount of power, both sides, I'm not talking about just Republican or Democrat, both sides, the president has unimagined power. George Washington issued 8 executive orders in his 8 years. Obama and Trump both issued over 200. So I'm not alone in thinking that the imperial presidency needs to be restrained somehow. And my tongue-in-cheek idea was to go back to 3 presidents. I don't think that's a great idea, but there are workable ways to make the president less powerful and empower Congress which was originally supposed to be representing the people.
And so if our founders were with us today, and really understood the evolution of this, what would their ideas and what were your ideas on potentially curbing some of the presidential powers?
Well, yeah, I think they would be shocked by so much. I mean, I think they would be pleased by some that we still have, that the Constitution still exists and we still pay tribute to it. And some of the ideas do seem to have held up beautifully. But they would also be shocked by how much in their opinion, we've gone awry.
Mhm.
And one thing that is easy, and it may not sound like a big deal, but this idea of the supermajority in Senate, you need 60 people to pass any laws. Now, this was not in the Constitution. And in fact, James Madison opposed it. He wrote a letter saying this is a terrible idea because it came up a few decades after the Constitution was ratified. And he said, you are going to be have a tyranny of minority. You're going to have a small group of people who can control and stop legislation. You don't want a tyranny of the majority. They were very concerned about that, but you also don't want this tyranny. So I, along with many others, think that getting rid of this cloture, this idea of supermajority and 60 people in Senate, would go a long way towards empowering the Congress to be able to act. Because right now, it's so hard to get anything through Congress, which is why the president and the Supreme Court have taken up the power vacuum.
Well, we can talk more about some of the different ideas that have come out of your year of living constitutionally. Let's shift gears for a moment with the upcoming election, and first, to make it fun, maybe talk a little bit about what election day was like, in the 18th century. And you showed a slide of the election day cake as an example, but talk a little bit about what was it like voting back then?
Yeah, well, one of the big themes of the book is that the past had its wonderful parts and its terrible parts, and we've got to be able to pick and choose. So in some senses, we do not want to go back to the 18th century voting. It was racist, it was sexist, indigenous people go vote. Also, most places did not have secret ballots. By far the vast majority, you voted by voice. You would walk in, and I actually, since I was trying to replicate the original voting, I walked into my Upper West Side cafeteria at a school and I said, I would like to vote. And they said, shh, you can't say that. So they got very annoyed. But that is the way you did it. And it was only later that, so I am in favor of the secret ballot.
Mhm.
But there were parts, as I said, that were wonderful. And one of those was that for those people privileged enough to vote, which,
Mhm.
as we said, was not everyone, Election Day was a festival. It was this astounding new right that after thousands of years of being ruled by arbitrary kings, you could choose. And so Election Day had this festive feel to it. You had election parades, you had election music, you had election rum punch, a lot of rum punch, and you had election cakes. People would bake these cakes and bring them to the polls to celebrate this amazing new right. And I thought, well, this is wonderful. Let's recapture the joy of democracy and remind ourselves of this amazing right. And our catchphrase was democracy is sweet. So I was able to, I used Facebook, which I know is not 18th century, but it is one of the older platforms. That was my
Yeah.
argument. And I got people in all 50 states to bake election cakes last November. And they brought them to the polls. And it was just this slice, no pun intended, of positivity in what is sometimes now seen as a very stressful time. And so I am doing it again. And we've got hundreds of people across the country baking these cakes, decorating them in creative ways, and bringing them to the polls or even just to the office, just to remind people that democracy is sweet and we've got to work to keep it. I don't think cake is the solution, but I call it a gateway carb. Like it gets us back involved, and then we can address things like gerrymandering, which really are huge problems in our democracy.
Well, I love the idea of the cake. It also would be a wonderful way of engaging, future generations or younger generations. What would be more fun than having cake? Personally, I would say that I need some rum punch coming into the upcoming election. What was it like? What did the rum punch taste like? Was that good?
It's quite delicious. It is Martha Washington's recipe, and there is like, yeah, so lemon juice, orange juice, two different kinds of rum. uh, and it packs a wallop. And I did actually, so I did it, the election cake 2 years. This will be my third year doing it. And that first year I did hand out on the streets of New York City rum punch, and I was surprised how many people took alcohol from a stranger. But I guess it's that type of year that, as you say, people are stressed enough that they are willing to do it.
Themes in all of this is how should the interpretation of the Constitution and this idea of originalism versus a living constitutionalism. And so I'm curious, through this experience and this authenticity of the experience, what are some of your thoughts around how we interpret the Constitution and those two competing, or they're against each other, they're ideas.
Sure. Yeah. Well, yeah, that was one of the huge issues in this book and this project. And just to give, since I sort of vaguely understood it, but I now understand it a little better, there are two very different ideas of how to interpret the Constitution. The originalists say that the most important thing when reading the Constitution is, what did the words mean at the time it was ratified? And that's how you should interpret it. And 5 of the 9 justices on the Supreme Court believe in some sort of originalism. Those are the conservative wing. The other side is sometimes called pragmatism or living constitutionalism. And they say, yes, take into account the original meaning of the words, but also look at how the decision might be affect society today. Look at previous Supreme Court decisions in the last 20 years and weigh these different factors. That's why it's sometimes called pragmatism. Now, I think it's very important. I'm a big fan of what I call steel manning. I didn't come up with the term, but straw man is when you attack someone else's point of view by caricaturing it. Steel man, state the other person's point of view as strongly as possible. So I do believe strongly in steel manning, and I try to present the strongest point of view for both sides. In the end, not to give a spoiler alert, I do believe that pragmatism is a better way to look at the Constitution. Both sides have their flaws. Neither is perfect. But to give an example that I referenced earlier, the 14th Amendment, if you are a true originalist like Clarence Thomas, and he believes this, you should only interpret the 14th Amendment using the mindset from when it was ratified right after the Civil War. And it was ratified to protect Black men from white supremacy. They were not thinking about women. They were not thinking about gay people, certainly not about trans people. So Clarence Thomas has indicated he would roll back decisions like the constitutional right to gay marriage, because he believes the 14th Amendment does not cover that. And my feeling is, you do have to look at where the train came from, but you also have to look at where it is now and where it's going. Now, this would not be so important if you were able to make amendments. As I said, if you could do an amendment where the people vote for gay marriage, fine, then you can be a total originalist. But without the ability to make amendments realistically, something has to give. So I do believe the Constitution should be like, have a little elasticity, like a pair of pants with an elastic waistband. You want some structure. You can't say anything. You can't make it turn into clay and say anything, but you want a little give so that it can change as our society evolves.
Well, and the idea, especially the beautiful metaphor of you living constitutionally, dressing, writing with a quill pen, all of those things. I think I'm interested in learning about what it was like to live at that time. I don't want to go back to living at that time. And in fact, recently, I was in Asheville, North Carolina when the hurricane struck, and within days, it felt like we were back in the 1800s. We lost all of the modern conveniences of communications and everything. So I do think that is interesting. And if I remember correctly, you mentioned that that there have been like 10,000 attempts at adding an amendment or something, which shows that it's like a 99.7 or something chance you're not going to get an amendment done. So it's so hard that leaves us in this difficult situation.
100%. And I love what you say about, unfortunately, that you got to experience how important some of our technology is. Now, I do think, as with most things, including the Constitution, is a double-edged sword, because there were parts of living in the 18th century that I loved, including writing with a quill pen, because I felt that it changed the way my brain worked. So I couldn't be distracted by the dings and the pop-up ads for baldness cures that are I could actually focus and concentrate and write letters and really look at the nuances and get deep. And I think it was better for my brain. And I still try. I don't think you need to have a quill pen, but writing by hand or even just writing offline is so important to our thinking. And I don't think we'd have a country if we tried to write the Constitution by a Google Doc where everyone was chiming in or people were tweeting their opinions. It would be a disaster.
Yeah, no, that is interesting. And I recently met the presidential historian Doris Kearns Goodwin, and she mentioned, I don't know if she still does it, but that she wrote her books longhand, and so her version of the quill pen.
I love that. And you also, I think about this often, because you said that when you met her, that she said she was optimistic about the future of our country. And that
Yes.
is wonderful, because she's brilliant. So yeah. And she said that, was her point was that we've been through really tough times before.
Absolutely. It was actually Doris Kearns Goodwin and then my mom's 100-year-old partner, who they've been together 20, 25 years. And the two of them were saying, like, we've been through way more difficult times than, as troubling as it seems right now, than now. And she mentioned the Civil War, 600,000 dead, or this massive amount of loss and suffering. And then my mom's partner, who's 100, mentioned living through, he was in World War II. And so he was on Okinawa. And so he talked about a little bit about that. So yes, I think the combination of her belief that that the systems, the balance of power, all the things that are in place have sustained us and will continue. And I think his perspective of having just lived a very long time, both of them were optimistic, which was great.
I love that, and that makes me feel great. And and to add to that, just the fact of that we have a country at all is quite mind-blowing, because we went up against this ragtag group, went up against the best military on earth, and it wasn't even I wouldn't say we counted as underdogs. We were under puppies. I don't know what we were, but we were. The fact that we won and were able to establish an independent country, that alone is astounding.
It is. So how do you think that we got here to is it this inability to pass amendments, or how did we get here where the Supreme Court and the president are really so powerful now? What do you think created that scenario?
Well, a lot of things went into it. One is just presidents would do power grabs for good reason. So like during the Depression, FDR, during the Civil War, Lincoln, Lincoln, my favorite president. But he did increase the power of the president by leaps and bounds. And then once you have power, human nature is not very good at giving it back. So that was just one example. Also, just our misinterpretation of history and this idea that most people had, including me, that the Supreme Court always had final say on the Constitution. Not true. Not true. You talk to great scholars like Jonathan Gannap at Stanford. Back in the founding, most founding fathers would say, no, the Supreme Court is one voice. but you got to listen to what the president says and what Congress says. And it was a little messy, which is partly why the Supreme Court was able to take over and have this idea of not just judicial review, but judicial supremacy. They have the last and final and most important word on what is the Constitution.
So let's talk about just the overall context of this experience. And so what were some unexpected benefits, or if you had any revelations? I always like to try and take from things that we're learning, like what's the one thing? And so what would be, benefits, any revelations, or the one thing from the year of living constitutionally?
Well, can I give two quick things?
Please, choose even better.
All right, one is just how important framing is. And this is because right now you have two sides. You have one group who sort of see the Constitution as the sacred document that should not be messed with, and it's perfect by these demigods. And then on the other extreme, you have people who say it is a document of oppression and elitism, and it should be scrapped. Now, this is not a new debate. And in fact, right before the Civil War, you had these two sides. You had William Lloyd Garrison, who is one of the top two abolitionists. He said the Constitution is a pact with the devil. It's a contract with Beelzebub. And he said it deserves to be burned. And he would burn copies on stage. Like, he was a showman. At first, Frederick Douglass, the other great abolitionist, at first Frederick Douglass agreed with him. And Frederick Douglass, of course, was a former enslaved man who went on to be a great writer. But sometime in the 1850s, Douglass changed his mind. And he said, no, let's, instead of burning it, let's look at it as a promissory note, because it has these wonderful passages about equality and about liberty and the blessings of liberty and we the people. But America is not living up to those promises. Let's try to fight to make America live up to those promises. And that interpretation is very influential. Martin Luther King Jr. talked about the Declaration and Constitution as just that, a promissory note. So did Barack Obama. And I love that framing. So framing is everything. I love the idea of trying to make the Constitution live up to its better parts. It contains the seeds of liberty, and we just have to work to make those seeds grow. Second and final takeaway, well, that's not true. There were lots of takeaways, as you'll see in the book, but one more I want to mention is in most cases, it takes thousands, millions of people to do social change. But at the same time, paradoxically, one person can make a huge difference in progress. And one of my favorite stories I learned, which I didn't know, and some you may know it, Eric, or some of you, but I didn't. It was about a woman named Phoebe Byrne, who had such a huge influence on history. Now, this was 1920. The 19th Amendment had been passed by Congress, but to make it go into effect, you needed 3/4 of the states, their legislatures, to say yes. Now, it came down to one state, Tennessee. If Tennessee said yes, 19 women could vote. If they said no, women could be delayed for decades. Then it came down to one person. It was 50-50 in the legislature. And there was this one guy, Harry Byrne, who was leaning towards voting against the 19th Amendment, meaning women would not have the right to vote. His mother, the morning of the vote, wrote a note and put it in his suit pocket. And the note said, "Be a good boy." And she even made and vote for ratification. She even made a little pun. She said, "Don't be a rat, vote for ratification." And that day he looked at the note in his pocket and he decided to vote for the 19th Amendment. Legend has it it was so controversial, he was chased out of the Senate House and he had to jump out the window. I don't think that part is true, but it is true that it was one man and one woman and a very controversial vote, and that changed history. So I do feel stressed sometimes and I feel powerless, but stories like that just do give me hope that some sometimes one person can make a big difference.
I love that story. I think it's fantastic, and it really speaks to this American experiment and how amazing it is. And at any given moment, we may get very focused on a particular challenge, but when you do take and zoom out and look at it in the context of history, going back to its origins, that what a wonderful story that is, and I love that. And I think that we should shift over to our Q&A. I have a few more questions, but I really want to get our audience engaged in this as well. Want to hear some of your ideas that come out of this that could make democracy better. But let's bring Jessica back in, and Jessica and I will bring these questions to you.
This has been such a great conversation. So I'm going to start with a question that was submitted prior to today. Did you interview experts on the Constitution as preparation for or during your constitutional year? And if so, who? Why did you choose them, and what did you learn? And then there's
Absolutely. I did it before, during, and after. And I had these, it was mostly law professors, but some others as well. And they were so generous with their time, which I'm so grateful for. And I tried to have a diversity of points of view. So I had people very far on the right and very far on the left. I had people who were so originalist, for instance, that they would not capitalize the phrase Supreme Court, because in the Constitution, the S is lowercase. And so that was one side. Another side, it was almost like they were postmodern and thought, well, the Constitution is just clay and we can make it say whatever we want. And I loved getting both sides. And when I finished the manuscript, I sent it out to dozens of professors to make sure that it was accurate and fair. And I made a lot of changes because, it's a hard topic, but I'm really grateful that I've gotten mostly positive feedback from both sides, that it presents the issues in a clear and positive way.
Another question, really interesting, in these two opposing views of originalism, and then looking at this as a living document, which of those doctrines put our individual rights more at risk in your view? Does the original view be one that's more protective of individual rights, or are we more likely to lose individual rights in one or the other perspectives?
Well, that's a very interesting question, and it has a lot to do with which right and also how you interpret them. But what I do think is interesting is originalism as it is practiced is not very originalist, because the Supreme Court justices are not historians. So their interpretation of the original meaning is often flawed. And I've interviewed dozens of professors who hold this point of view. And one example is just that, on individual rights. At our country's founding, their view of rights was very different than our view of rights. I happen to be a huge fan of individual rights. They saw individual rights as important, but very much balanced by the good of the community. And your rights, you did not have rights as these trump cards, no pun intended, that you had rights that were balanced by, and that is seen in the First Amendment. The First Amendment, you could say something, you could print something, but if it threatened the community, you could face punishment. So they had a much bigger sense of rights being balanced by responsibilities. So being part of the community, the greater good. Now that has its pros and cons. I do think there are advantages to going back to a little more of a balance with the community and thinking not just about my rights, but how does it affect the society at large.
great. And this question that I'm about to ask came up a few different times and in a few different ways, but gets to a really important question of, what happens if no candidate receives 270 electoral votes? And what does the Constitution say we do from there, as a reminder to everybody on the call?
Oh, that's a good question. And I am actually not an expert on this type of thing in the Constitution. I mean, I believe that doesn't it go to the House? It
House
goes
of
to-
Representatives, yeah.
Right.
Yes.
But I think, first of all, not everything is spelled out in the Constitution. It is only 4 pages. So much of this is up to interpretation and tradition. And the other point is the idea of the Electoral College itself it was a huge compromise. No one was happy with it. And the Constitution does not talk, for instance, does not say it's a winner take all system on the states. So I had always thought, oh, if one candidate wins a state, they get all the votes. That is not true. And as you might know, there are 2 states which do not do this. It's Maine and I believe Nebraska. But that's because the Constitution doesn't specify it. There is so much left open in the Constitution, and there are a lot of people who say it would be better if the electoral votes could be split. Now, there are other people who say that wouldn't solve problems. We need to get rid of the Electoral College altogether. And there are people who defend the Electoral College. I am not a fan of the Electoral College. I don't think it does what it was supposed to do. I think it just confuses things and allows for popular vote to be devalued.
And so one of the things when we talk about, a couple of ideas that came out of this is the getting rid of the Electoral College, one of the top ideas. And then would that mean that means moving back to a popular vote?
Yeah, and it's going to be hard, as we say, with the so maybe the best mid-step is to go to a split vote. I also think the founders would be baffled by the fact that there are 600,000 people, Americans, who have very little right to vote, meaning the residents of Washington, D.C., who I think they can vote for the president, but they're not represented by Congress except for one sort of non person who has actual no power. And you look at the history and why that happened, and I'll just tell you very quickly why it happened, so you understand why it happened, but why now with 600,000 people, the founders would be shocked. And it happened because before the Constitution, we had the Articles of Confederation. The Congress was in Philadelphia. There was a march on Congress by war veterans who wanted to be paid, and they felt they surrounded Independence Hall where Congress was and would not let them out. So Congress was imprisoned, and Congress said to the governor of Pennsylvania, John Dickinson, call in the guard, get these people out of here. He refused to do it for whatever reason. He didn't want to. So they said, never again will Congress be in a place that's reliant on another state or another governor. We are going to have our own little island of individuality, which is totally understandable. But now 600,000 people, that's a tremendous number of people not to be democratically represented.
And which is why all of their license plates say taxation without representation.
Yeah.
I think it's a good point. I think it's a very good point.
Okay, so we're going to talk, I think there's a question on right to bear arms. And so you also exercised your 18th century Second Amendment rights by carrying a musket around Manhattan and actually firing it with a regiment of reenactors. But what insights did your experience give you about kind of modern day gun rights and the interpretation today?
Oh, yes. And for this, I talked to some great scholars, including Saul Cornell, who I recommend his book on the Second Amendment. Well, let me just very briefly lay out the 2 sides, and then I'll tell you where I land. The 2 sides are, one side, the sort of the gun control side, says, this document was written when we had muskets. Now, I fired a musket. It is a very different experience. It takes 15 steps to fire a musket. So it took me like over a minute to load. You got to put the gunpowder in, take out the ramrod, put the ramrod in, take out. So it is like building a desk from IKEA. It is not a simple. So something like a mass shooting would be very different under a musket. So the gun control side says Yeah, if you have a law written in the 1700s that says, sure, you can have wheeled vehicles come onto my farm, because wheeled vehicles were wheelbarrows. Now we have, 18-wheel trucks. So we have to change the law. The technology has changed so much that this old law does not apply, even though they're both called arms or guns. Now, the other side, the gun rights side, says, no, that's what it says in the Constitution. Your right to bear arms shall not be infringed. And that's what it says. That's what it means. Otherwise, look at the First Amendment. If the First Amendment only applied to Ben Franklin's wooden press, where would we be? There would be no First Amendment because the internet would be censored. So those are the two sides. Um, I I do fall on the side that the technology has changed so much that we do need some sort of regulation. So I am on that side. I believe in the right to bear arms, but I think that there needs to be things like, what kind of arms and what kind of background checks. But again, I did try in the book to represent both sides.
And maybe certification, the more complex and sophisticated the gun, the higher level of certification to be able to use it. But maybe to lighten it up a little bit, I know that some of the things that was fun about living constitutionally is the language everyone used and even different sayings. And so isn't there a saying, flash in the pan, that ties into using a musket or something like that?
That's exactly right. I mean, it was so interesting to see where a lot of these cliches come from, because they actually have an origin in reality. And one is flash in the pan. Flash in the pan means the pan is in a gun. It's right near the trigger, and you pour gunpowder in the pan. It's like a little bowl, and then the gunpowder goes in, and it strikes, and the fire goes in and shoots the bullet out, or the lead ball. And a flash in the pan means that if the explosion happens in the pan but never gets to the barrel of the gun, so a flash in the pan is like big explosion but nothing happens, and that is where the
Still means the same
phrase comes.
thing.
Yeah, it has certainly kept its meaning.
AJ, a lot of the we talked about the cakes, which I loved the election cakes. I fully support bringing those back, anything to do with cake. But are there any other traditions that you feel like constitutionally would be fun to revisit? And like, if there's one beyond cake that you would want to reintroduce to society, what might that be?
Oh, I love that question. Well, one is writing by hand. I love that. Another is the idea of meeting in person. I had a sort of 18th century style dinner party where we served beef stew with cloves. They loved cloves, and just talking to, it was people from all over the political spectrum came to my apartment, and we had a wonderful discussion. And we didn't agree on everything, but we did agree more people need to do this, meet face to face. And another one that Eric and I were just discussing briefly before this, and I want to hear more about his point on this. As part of this, it turns out there's a movement for people to do family constitutions, or even roommate constitutions, where you make a sort of mission statement about your family and what are your rights and what are your responsibilities, and then sort of the rules. And I did that, and it was wonderful. It was a really fascinating process. It was hard because I have 3 sons, and all of them were like Rhode Island. Rhode Island didn't even show up at the Constitutional Convention, so I had to wrangle them individually. But I feel it was really enlightening. And Eric told me about a similar idea that I'm very excited about and plan to pursue.
I am going to send you a copy, but the idea is the ethical will, which was a tradition that patriarchs and matriarchs a very long time ago would write family wisdom, family mission, lessons learned, and wisdom, share wisdom to the next generation. So when I was reading that idea of a family constitution, I think that knitting those ideas together is, I think, a really something worth thinking about. And then this idea of getting people around the table with different perspectives, it does seem like that the nation is so divided, and having ways of getting together and hearing people with different perspectives and hearing them full on, even though I might disagree with what I'm hearing, I think that seems like a really powerful idea too.
Yeah, it was a wonderful experience, and I recommend it to everyone. And you don't have to make beef stew or candlelight, but it was fun. It was fun, and we told some 18th century jokes, which are not,
Are they still funny?
well, they're very dad joke, bounding dad joke. I'll just give you one very quickly, which was, this was from the famous joke book of the day. It said there was a mathematician, and he and his wife had no children. Another woman said to his wife, "Your husband is a wonderful mathematician." And she said, "Yes, but he cannot multiply." So that's, it's like a dad joke. So
Yes, that is, I would classify that as a dad joke now.
a great, great, great,
For
great,
sure.
great granddad joke. Yes.
So AJ, one thing that I love to ask our guests is around a question, like sort of the best question that you feel that you've ever asked or that you've been asked, and whether it's from A Year of Living Constitutionally or these other experiential books that you've written. What's your favorite question, either you like to ask or that you've been asked?
Well, first of all, I think that's a great question. So that is in the top 5 of my favorite questions, is what question do you like? So that's one. Another question I love to get asked and ask is, what have you changed your mind about? Because I do think that when you change your mind the right way, not because of pressure or because you're flip-flopping just to be contrary, but if you really think deeply about a topic and change your mind, that's wonderful. That's evolution. That's great. And I think that the best of our founding fathers believed in this strongly. At the convention, Ben Franklin said, "The older I get, the less certain I am of my own opinion," which I think is a lovely statement. And he even told a story at the convention in a speech. He said, a little jest, it was a little joke. He said, there was this French lady, and she said to her sister, "Sister, why is it? It's so strange. Why is it I'm the only person I've ever met who is correct on every single issue?" And his point was, she's not, of course, and we are all that French lady. We all think we're correct on every single issue. And this has been borne out by modern psychology. People like Daniel Kahneman are talking about this, and Ben Franklin was talking about it 250 years ago. And his point was, keep an open mind, be flexible. When you're talking to someone, he recommended this in his autobiography, don't say words like absolutely or obviously or certainly. Say things like, "It seems to me," "I could be wrong, but perhaps evidence will prove otherwise, however." And that, to me, makes for much more productive conversations and makes me happier too, because then I'm not totally wedded to one idea and have all of my identity linked to this one idea being correct when it might turn out to be wrong.
That's
Our-
awesome.
Our next question is, after spending a year of living the original constitutional meaning, do you believe our federal government today is following the limited enumerated powers granted to it and envisioned by our founding fathers?
Well, it is interesting that the sort of the balance between the federal government and the state government, and it is something I never thought about as much, and it's a fascinating, because they're sort of frenemies. And some of the founders, like Hamilton, said, "Wait, why do we have states? Why, this is such a strange system. Let's get rid of the states. Let's get rid of," he said that in a speech at the convention. He said, basically, get rid of the states because people cannot serve two masters. This is strange. Over the decades, over the centuries, the states have lost power overall. Now they've gained some in more recent years, like the Dobbs decision on abortion gives states more power. So the overall graph is states have lost power, but then they're getting some of it back a little bit. I always was skeptical of state power because I saw it as it's often used to sort of stifle civil rights. That's the one tradition. But in the in the tradition of keeping an open mind, like Ben Franklin, I see now that there are advantages to state rights. And if it's used properly, states can be what Louis Brandeis called um, the laboratories of democracy. You can come up with interesting ideas on a state level. And if they work, maybe other states will adopt them and then the federal government will adopt them. Now, I don't think that happens enough because the states are controlled now by national parties and they are not really these individual actors. But if we can get back to that, I think that would make for a better country and a stronger country.
One question, AJ, is around the parties and what our founders would think if they came back now. Do you think they would be surprised at these sort of deeply ingrained two parties that we have, or would they expect to see a third party, or I mean, maybe even a fourth party, but certainly more than just what we have right now, this sort of oligopoly?
Yes, I think most of them, even though it did start very early on with the Jeffersonians versus the Federalists, they would be shocked and saddened by how divided into these two parties it is. James Madison, for instance, George Washington hated the whole idea of parties, factions. He just hated it. James Madison said, it's going to happen. We have to accept it, but let's make it a feature, not a bug. Let's make it so that there are a bunch of competing interests and 6 or 7 or 8 parties, and you can make these alliances and then dissolve them. And that will balance it out. That will mean that no one party will have this monopoly on power. Now that did not happen. We basically went into these two rigid parties. So I think most founders would be saddened by this biopoly or whatever you call it, this two-party stranglehold on our country.
Well, I know we are at time, but I just want to thank you, AJ. Thank you, Eric. I feel a sense of hope, and I do think that this book is an incredible book to give to others. It's an incredible book for young people, and as it is so critically important that we all better understand this document that has served as such a significant role in all of our lives, whether we know it or not. So thank you all for being here today, and happy election day next week. See everybody soon.
Thank
Thank
you
you,
all.
AJ. Thank you, Jessica.
Thank you.